Welcome, listeners. I'm so excited. We have a book author, a new book, a necessary book with us today. And we have Siri Chilazi, who is a senior researcher at the Women in Public Policy program at Harvard Kennedy School, whose life's work is to advance gender equality in the workplace. She's a keynote speaker, strategic advisor, and Siri collaborates with a wide range of organizations all around the world. She has an MBA from the Harvard Business School and a master's in public policy and a BA in chemistry and physics. And she is co-author of the amazing new book, Make Work Fair. And so I'm so excited, Siri, to have you.
Thank you, Julie. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for that incredibly kind and generous intro.
Well, tell us what, books, a lot of folks don't realize, like we come up with the book idea years in advance, we research, and then we write it, and then it sits with the publisher and all these processes behind the scenes. So tell us what dawned on you and Iris getting together to co-author this? Like, what was the problem you were hoping to solve?
It's such a great question, and you're right. You can't control the timing of when these things enter the world. Our book has been even more timely than we could have possibly imagined because the things that are going on around the world right now, we couldn't have possibly imagined. We have both my co-author, Iris Bennett, who's also at Harvard Kennedy School, and we've collaborated for a long time. We're both behavioral scientists. Both of us are passionate about generating solutions to well-known problems. So studying, okay, if we know that there's discrimination, bias in the workplace, and it manifests in all these ways, how could we actually change the way we do work to eradicate those problems? And one of the things that we've come across in a lot of our work with organizations and in talking with practitioners is that there's often a gap between what's happening on the ground and what people are doing and the knowledge and the insights that we're generating in academia. We actually know much more than people realize about what works and what doesn't to
Mm.
close all these gender gaps and to make work more fair. But understandably, people on the front lines are busy doing their full-time job. They don't have time to go hunting for these 70-page academic papers that are full of statistical
Uh,
jargon and
And
that
they're
are really
hard to
hard to read.
understand. I know they're written for peer review for other academics. I'm like, how do we translate this?
Exactly. Oh, and you just said the magic word translate, right? We're both very passionate about this idea of research translation. So
Mm.
making the insights accessible to the world. And that, in a nutshell, is why we decided to write the book. And it just happened to come out at a time where these conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion, what's the future of DEI? Is DEI dead? How do we continue to make work fair? All of these conversations are incredibly topical.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And I think the concept of fairness really resonates. I know another thought leader that y'all collaborated with, and I certainly follow and recommend to everyone, Lily Zhang. The FAIR framework has been something that HBR has been talking actively about. And so it's kind of fun to see different ways of approaching fairness in the workplace. And I know for me, I just went through my, within the last year or two, psychological safety certification. And part of it's like knowing your values and like what creates psychological safety for you personally. And my fairness barometer series is like so high, it's like 98%. So like if I'm in an environment that doesn't feel fair, I don't feel safe. I don't
Yeah.
trust it, which explains my abrupt tenure in corporate America.
But Julie, you're not alone. Actually, one
Right.
of the reasons why we picked, again, well before the current moment, why we landed on fairness as the title and as the underpinning thing for our underpinning concept for our book, is that there's so much research around the world that shows that fairness is a fundamental value. It's an extremely widely shared human value. And kids as young as 4, 5, 6 years old develop a
Hmm.
very keen sense of what's fair and what's not, and
Hmm.
also have very strong reactions to perceived
Hmm.
unfairness. And
Hmm.
so we felt like this is the common ground from which we can all start to then build and say, hey, we all agree that
Hmm.
this is something important. This is something we want to strive towards. Let us show
Hmm.
you the data to explain that we are not living in a fair world or in fair workplaces yet. Now let's have a
Hmm.
data based conversation about what can get us there.
Right. Yeah, the what I learned about fairness is that you're right, young kids expect it, right? That's not fair. I mean, that's such a common thing children say. And it also elicits a part of our brain that's associated with disgust. So we don't
Mm.
feel fairness, we feel disgusted. Like it's like eating bad food or something. It is a visceral reaction, but I think it's tied to the fact that we're a social species. And if things aren't fair, we can't really coexist in a functional, sustainable way if people are taking and people are taking advantage of others, or it's not
Yeah.
fair. So, thinking about that lens for the workplace, Siri, I'd love, there's so many great myths I think you dispel in some of the earlier chapters. And one of them, and this is a big bugaboo for me, is this myth of meritocracy. So,
Mm.
it's kind of interesting. We absorb these messages, like pull ourselves up by these bootstraps that we don't have. And that metaphor just really doesn't resonate with a lot of people. Or that somehow hard work will just seemingly pay off, and especially here in the States with a more individualist type of culture. Why is that like a challenge in the workplace for some of the research and the tools that works with fairness?
There's actually a really interesting paper by Emilio Castilla, who's a scholar at MIT. About 10 years ago, he published a paper called The Myth of Meritocracy. He worked with a large organization studying their internal data, and he found that the more the organization emphasized meritocracy and talked about being meritocratic, actually, the more biased that the
Mhm,
decisions were that managers were making about whom to
mhm,
promote and what kind of compensation to give people.
mhm,
I will say, I think at its most fundamental, meritocracy is actually a beautiful vision to strive for because meritocracy is defined as a system in which people advance or are given power according to
mhm,
their demonstrated skills and talents, i.e., their
mhm,
merit. And again, I think most of us would listen to that and say, absolutely, that's the kind of system that I want to live in.
mhm,
I think where the disagreement comes in is whether we think that we live in a meritocracy today or whether we think that we had a meritocracy in the past and that that's
mhm,
a state of the world that we should somehow return to, or
mhm,
as the evidence really clearly suggests, the world has never actually seen a meritocracy in action
mhm.
yet. And it's a state of the world that we have to create going forward. So let me give you just one example because I'm all about the data, right? You can't just say stuff, but you have to have some evidence to back up your arguments. There's more than 300 so-called audit studies that have been conducted around the world. And in these audit studies, researchers send two versions of an otherwise identical resume and they apply to real open jobs. So
Mhm,
there's only one thing that's different between these two resumes. It could be the name at the top, which maybe could indicate gender, ethnicity. It could be the graduation year from college, which indicates that one of the people is older, one of them is younger, or maybe something super small, like in your extracurricular section, you mentioned that you're a member of the PTA, the Parent Teacher Association, which
mhm,
indicates that you're a parent. And then the other resume is otherwise identical. It just doesn't have that little mention of the PTA. So notice how these things that researchers vary actually have nothing to do with people's merit, right? Because they're just life experiences or personal demographic
Right.
characteristics, not the actual skills, competencies, education, past work experience that is actually reflecting of what your merit is. So the point is that if we lived in a true meritocracy, these two identical resumes with one little change should have an equal chance at getting a call back from the company saying, yep, we
Right.
want to interview for this job because their merit is exactly the same. And of course, these more than 300 studies show that that is not what actually happens.
Mhm,
Systematically, people who are more stereotypical are more likely to get called back. So think of a man applying for a tech job or a woman applying to be a kindergarten teacher. Ageism is real in the workplace. Parental bias is real in
yeah.
the workplace, especially for women. And so these patterns are really well documented. And it just goes to show that things that have nothing to do with your competency, your capability, do influence your chance of getting in the door and then rising up through the ranks, which is just not consistent with a meritocratic system.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I love that case study. I love kind of the A/B testing approach that you offer in the book too, which, you know, it's such, we use this again in academics, but translating it into corporate work on hiring decisions, on all these decisions that could represent merit. And I think you're absolutely right. That's like we want to believe in merit. And really, inclusion work is trying to establish a meritocracy that, to your point, there never really was. But it's kind of flying in the face of the falsehood that we learned culturally that that's the way things worked. And I
Mm.
think there's a real rub for people that have to do their own education to get over that false kind of message and learn a new message. And so one of the things that just kept bubbling up for me as I was reading Work Make Work Fair is this whole idea, you make a lot of arguments for the systems approach, which I love. I love systems. I wish organizations would change systems. It'd be like so much easier than individual by individual training on things. But it kind of it got to me like at first I was like, it's a systems book, and then I was like, no, there's a lot of individual stories in here. And to me, I had this kind of epiphany of like most inclusion work, it's a paradox. It's a both and. It's not individual versus systems. It's not either or. So we need to fix the systems, to your point about the hiring process having objective criteria in that example. But we also need to train managers on biases to look out for, or when you are hiring, here are some things that we want you to consider. And so I just wonder what your take is on that,
Mm.
Siri. This whole, at least maybe in the DI world, we have this internal conflict of like, do we do individual stuff? Do we do system stuff? But I think you make a really nice case for the bundled approach that there's a both and here. Correct me
Yeah,
if
I
I'm
love, no, I no, I there's definitely a both and a yes and I love that you asked this question because it really comes up all the time. And that challenge of what do we focus our limited time and resources and effort
right. That's
on
exactly it.
really
Like we only
comes
get
up.
one thing,
Because
like we
if
got to
we could do
jam it in.
everything right, this wouldn't be a conundrum. So systems change is really the thing that works, that has been proven to work, because unconscious bias lives in all of us humans, and there's actually no evidence to suggest that we can fundamentally de-bias human brains.
Right.
We can de-bias our decisions and our behaviors because our behaviors and our decisions are to a very great extent influenced by the systems that surround us. But we can't sort of fundamentally expect to de-bias human brains, and even changing people's deeply held beliefs or attitudes is
Mhm.
really, really difficult, and
Yeah.
actually might even be impossible to engineer, at least. So systems change is the answer, but then the question becomes, well, how do systems change? And I think this is where the
For
yes and
people.
comes in, because systems can change in big top-down ways. If you're the CEO, if you're a head of HR, you wave your magic wand and say, from now on, we're going to promote people based on different criteria. That's awesome. That's very fast. But systems can also change in bottom-up ways, where
Mhm.
you as an individual, even a very junior person with minimal kind of authority and influence in the organization, just start doing your own work differently,
Yeah.
making small
Mm.
tweaks. And then maybe you share your new approach with a colleague and they get inspired and they start to do the same thing.
Yeah.
We share in the book this example of Roz Atkins, the British journalist at the BBC, who realized that as much as he wanted his journalism to be representative of the world, he had no idea, he had no way of knowing if that was actually happening because he had no
Mhm.
data. So he and his team decided to count. They had a 1 hour news show that they presented every night. So at the end of their 60 minutes on air, they just quickly went through who appeared on screen in these 60 minutes and how many of these people were women and how many were men. So super simple, pen to post it. They generated this data themselves, and realized initially actually that only 39% of their expert contributors were women. And then they set themselves a goal of getting to 50-50, and hit it successfully over a couple months. And then, they kept it, they got there in a couple months, but then they kept the methodology going for years, for as long as the project was on air. And ultimately, more than 750 other content creating teams within the BBC joined them, because it was this grassroots
Yeah.
sparked
Yeah.
revolution of how do we think about actually doing our core work, which is generating the highest quality journalism. So that's an example of how you really can change how a global organization works without any formal power, without, a budget available to incentivize people, just
Right.
through your own example by establishing a proof of concept.
I love that. Proof of concept. And what I love about that too is it's instantaneous. It's close to the time of which that happened. And so there's some accountability of, it kind of reminds me, I used to have a colleague, we had a feedback issue in our culture. And so to your point, a bottoms up approach was people on my team would ask for feedback after a meeting. Hey, I want to pause and collect some feedback. Like what went well, what could have gone better? It's like it just all of a sudden, because you knew that question was going to get asked
Yeah.
after every meeting, not every meeting, but important meetings, that we were going to share feedback. And so we started to be more proactive about it. And kind of reminds me in allyship work that I do, it's like put the radar up, just start noticing these things. Once you start noticing it, again, back to fairness, you start to be like, that doesn't seem so fair. Even if it's not self-serving for me or people like me, it doesn't feel fair that we didn't have as many people of a different ethnicity, culture, gender on airtime, right? It just kind of appeals to that human need. So,
Yeah.
Siri, you make a great argument for like this systems approach and individual approach. Um, I really liked the part of the book that talks about embedding it into our culture. And, I think this is another thing in theory sounds lovely, but in practice becomes much more nuanced and you get
Mm,
pockets of inclusive cultures and not inclusive cultures. But it's really for me what hit is how you describe like norms. What becomes kind of, I don't not to use the word normal, but normative type of behavior, like symbols, rituals, interactions, you say everyday experiences that reinforce the direction we're headed on. It's kind of like conditioning, if you will. I'd love for our listeners that are wrestling with how to embed this into our culture. Like,
mm.
how do we embed these inclusive behaviors, norms more integrated?
Yeah, I love that you mentioned culture because that's people always say as a solution to anything, oh, we need to change culture.
Right,
I mean, yes, of course we do,
right,
but it sounds so big, right? It's like
right.
that big elephant. How do I even start eating this thing because
Mm-hmm.
it's so giant? And it also sounds kind of fluffy and amorphous. So
Mm-hmm.
in the book, we put forth a very, as we're behavioral scientists, our biases kind of is toward behaviors. We put forth this definition of culture as how we do things around here. So it's
Mm-hmm.
very behavioral because it's about doing, right? At the end of
Mm-hmm.
the day, people might have any beliefs and values internally, but the thing that you can observe about them is what
Mm-hmm.
they say and do externally. And sometimes
Mm-hmm.
that's congruent with their internal values, and sometimes it's not. So let me give you an interesting example, and this goes to the power of norms. This was a study done at Santander Bank in the UK, where they asked the men working at this bank how many of them were supportive of flexible work and thought it was great to work flexibly. And when I present this example in front of a group of people, I always ask them, so what do you think? What percentage of these guys at Santander were supportive of flexible work? And the answers typically range from 10 to 30%. In reality, 99% of
Yeah.
these men were like, flexible work is amazing. But then when they were asked, so what about your colleagues? What
Mm-hmm.
percentage of your colleagues do you think are supportive of flexible work? They assumed only 2/3 of their colleagues would be. And that discrepancy between what they themselves believed and what they thought their peers believed significantly influenced their behaviors. Because
Right.
when some of these men were accurately informed that, hey, actually, all your
Yeah.
peers also support remote work, their intentions to take parental leave went way up
Mm-hmm.
because their perception of how acceptable this would be and how it
Mm-hmm.
would be received by others changed.
Yeah.
And this is the power of norms because norms communicate what is going to be expected and accepted in a
Mm-hmm.
given context. And just mountains of research shows from around the world, from different contexts, that norms
Mm-hmm.
are a really powerful shaper of human behavior. So they can
Hmm.
both help us live up to our virtuous intentions. So let's say if we have a norm of not interrupting in meetings, it's just not something that happens. And if once in a while someone, interrupts anyway, either they get some glares and stares thrown at them, or someone actually jumps in and say, "Oh, excuse me, can we have Julie finish her point, please?" Right? So in that situation, norms are helping us sort of live up to our virtuous intentions and what we think makes for a more productive meeting environment.
Yeah.
But of course, norms can also hold us back from doing
Mhm.
positive, good things. So if you
Right.
have this norm, for example, that it's not okay to be gone from the workplace for any reason, even if you have a generous leave allowance on paper,
Hmm.
unlimited vacation time or up to a year
Hmm.
of parental leave.
But then people are
If
rumbling and complaining about it, and
and
yeah.
no one's actually taking it. And when you go
Hmm.
up to a manager and say, "Okay, so I'd like to take 3 weeks of vacation," and they go, "Oh,"
Hmm.
I mean, that behavior in the moment is so much more powerful at communicating what's actually acceptable than the policy on paper.
I know.
So back to your question of what can we do? How can we leverage norms to actually change behavior? It's small, everyday moments. If you're
Mhm.
in the meeting, do you look at everyone in the eye? Does everyone get introduced? If there's a piece of teamwork that has been done and one person is presenting it on behalf of the team, do they mention the names of other
Mhm.
colleagues involved? Or do they
Mhm.
list them? Do they credit the people on the title
Right.
slide? Or are they taking all of the credit? If you rely on cross-functional colleagues to help you with projects and they send you a piece of information that you need or do a favor for you, do you thank them? Do you recognize
Mhm.
them publicly? Or does it just go unmentioned and unrecognized, right?
Yep.
It's this small. The good news is there's umpteen moments. I don't even know, 50 moments on a daily basis like this, that we can either shift the norms in a positive direction of more inclusion, more recognition, more respect, or let the
Mhm.
norms languish.
Yeah. Yeah. I love those like micro moments of inclusion.
Yeah.
Really good examples. And I think it also confronts kind of the criticism of that approach. When I've talked about allyship before and, people interrupting the interrupter or being an upstander instead of a bystander, it kind of puts the ownership on the person to solve a systemic problem that shouldn't be occurring at the frequency it is. Therefore, we shouldn't need as many allies to speak up to it. But you're right. I mean, that modeling, I would say too, Siri, like I'm doing some research on a new book about people with power. And I'm curious for you because you definitely nest this into a lot of your chapters is people in positions of leadership and not necessarily positional. It could be
Mm.
informal too,
Hmm.
by influence, as we know. There's those people in the organization when they say something, people take note. We all know who those people are. So
Yes.
it doesn't have to be positional, but it can be. Does people in positions of leadership, Siri, I'm curious for you, like to me, it's so much more important that they model these behaviors. It's so much more important when someone asks for time off or a flexible day in their work week that they say, heck yeah. And they do it themselves too. What did
Yes.
you find in your research as far as like people with power? And I think we all want them to be further along on this journey than maybe they actually are. Like,
Mm.
so several questions there. Like, one, how important do you feel like they are in modeling some of this? And then two, like, why are they still struggling with these things?
Let me take the second one first, just because I think they're human just like the rest of us.
Yeah.
Just because they were put into a position of authority, or just because they, perhaps through their interpersonal skills or whatever, have that kind of influence over others, doesn't mean that they don't fall prey to all the same biases and just kind of stumbling blocks of being human. We all get overwhelmed, cognitively depleted, stressed. We're trying to multitask, right? There's all these reasons why living up to the best version of ourselves is hard for all of us. And I think leaders aren't exempt. But to your first question, they absolutely are demonstrably more influential, whether that's positional authority or social influence, at helping to shape norms and change culture for the organization. And therefore, I would absolutely argue that they have even a bigger responsibility, because they have that spotlight shining on them, and people are looking at what are they doing,
Hmm.
themselves, and then how do they respond? In fact, there was a fantastic study that Betsy Levy Pollock from Princeton did in some New Jersey middle schools where they were trying to reduce bullying. So they gave a randomly selected set of schools and the students within those schools a short intervention on anti-bullying and how to
Hmm.
stand up to it and how to make sure that you're not bullying yourself. And they found this intervention to be successful across the board, but it was exceptionally successful when the students that happened to be chosen to receive this intervention, this mini training, if you will, were sort of the quote unquote cool kids, the
Hmm.
influential ones. And
Yeah.
when they did and said things against bullying, it reverberated on a different
Yep.
level among their peers.
Hmm.
So if
Hmm.
you're out there listening and you know that you're one of the cool kids on the playground, in your social circles, in your workplace, know that you just have that much more power to be an agent for good, to be an agent for change.
No, it's a chance to be helpful for other people, one of our deepest primal needs. I mean, use that
Yeah.
influence for good. Yeah, I know. We're all human. It's a good reminder, choose.
I mean, I was going to say it's so disappointing, but not really, because I mean, being human is pretty amazing.
Well, and, to your point, I mean, I think a lot of the lessons learned, painfully over the last few years is, a lot of the training that we have, especially one and done check the box stuff like unconscious bias, is
Mhm.
we knew as practitioners it wasn't helpful, but you kind of get like not bullied, but pressured into doing that for an organization that has some goal or something they're convinced that's what's going to help them. But
Yeah.
like you said, it's these micro experiences with the systems to reinforce it is what I'm taking away from this conversation. You need to have the scaffolding, the structure around
Yes.
it to support people when they do take a risk. It shouldn't be a risk, but sometimes it is of speaking up or, doing something differently to facilitate inclusion. But there also needs to be an understanding of what those micro behaviors are so that you can seize the opportunity when it presents itself.
Yeah.
One of the examples you have in the book that I found really compelling was performance evaluations. Because a lot of us have focused on hiring and now with quotas versus goals, which we don't have to get into, but like that whole debate has made it a little bit more nebulous. I would say for performance evaluations, though, these are people at your organization already that you want to be better or succeed. So, like, there's a naturally built-in win-win here. Like, they're already
Yes.
here. Like, let's make
Yes.
sure that they're having a good experience and, building hopefully a career here. So I'm just curious, like, what balancing the systems versus individual approach with performance evaluations. I know y'all have a great framework in the book. Tell our listeners more about that.
Yeah. So the framework that we present in the book is in order to make work fair, you have to make fairness count, you have to make fairness stick, and you have to make fairness normal. So, in short, counting is just treating fairness using the same approaches that we use to manage our core business. So, we're collecting data, we're setting goals, we're implementing incentives to help us stay motivated to reach those goals, and then we're tracking and reporting. And that transparency of tracking creates accountability because you can know, wait, are we actually improving? Are we meeting the goals or not? And making it stick. So, actually, let me back up. In the context of performance evaluations, what could making it count look like? Well, we should definitely be tracking people's scores, looking
Mhm.
at are there systematic differences by things like race or gender, but also by function, perhaps by the manager that you have, because maybe some managers are more strict graders than others, some are more lenient graders, right? And you might kind of suffer in that comparison through no fault of your own. So using the data to help us identify patterns and see if there's any discrepancies. We could also collect data on things like the length of people's write-ups,
Mhm.
the language that's being used to describe people. There's a ton of research in the past that shows that there's a lot of bias, gender, racial, and otherwise, that goes
Mhm.
into performance evaluations. But the good
Mhm.
news is that's all measurable. You can literally flag the words and say, wait, men are described as a leader 6 times more often than women. What's
Mhm.
going on here? um, we should also use data to make sure that the same performance evaluation scores translate into the same types of reward and advancement for everyone. There's
Mm.
also past research that shows that even when, for example, women and men get exactly the same performance evaluations, men get more money and faster promotions off of those evaluations.
Mhm.
So that's all the role of making it count. And then making it stick is all about how do we make small tweaks to our existing systems to actually make them more fair. So, what could we tweak with performance evaluations? We could make them more timely so that instead of asking for feedback once a year when managers have long forgotten what you did 11 months ago, make
Right.
it more frequent so that your actual accomplishments are more top of mind. Also, making evaluations more sort of structured and bounded as opposed to really open ended has been shown to reduce bias. So instead of having an open text box that invites a manager to just comment on their direct report's performance, and however many number of words,
Right.
ask them a
Good
handful
job
of,
could
yeah,
suffice.
yeah. Ask them a few specific questions with word limits attached. Things like, what are these person's top two strengths that they should double down on going forward? What
Mhm.
is their one most critical development area? And
Mhm.
what can they do to address it? And require
Yeah.
behavioral examples for all of this evaluation. Because it's really easy to say things like, oh, they lack confidence, or they're not ready, or
Right. But
I'm
it's
not
not
impressed
specific. I
with
used to get that all
their.
the time. Like, you're too confident or you're too pleasing. It's like, which one do you want? I don't even know what to do with this.
Exactly. So the question I would then ask those people is, what did they do or say
Right.
that made it seem to you like they're too confident or
Right.
too pleasing?
Hmm.
And let's get down to that level of observable behaviors,
Yeah.
because that's when we can then decide if it's a fair assessment or not.
Mhm. Yeah. So good. So good. Yeah. And it's just easier to take action on. Knowing what you can do with that information, because it's really disheartening to hear I'm, not positive enough. It's like, what am I supposed to do? Like, I need to know what that
Yes,
behavior looks like in action so that I can understand it myself and then
exactly.
be willing to coach myself or get coaching from others on how to improve that.
But
Which,
also, we need to hold ourselves to higher standards about commenting on things that are actually relevant for the job.
Mhm.
So, depending on your role, being positive might be integral to that role. If you're in customer service, you want to
Point.
exude,
Yeah.
happy, joyful things. If you're just a data, not just, but if you are a data analyst or a software engineer, is that a core skill to be positive, or do you just need to be really good at coding or analysis?
That's
So I
so
think
good.
that's the other thing that often happens with evaluations, any kind of evaluations, right? Even in hiring, we latch on to attributes that aren't actually relevant to what it is that we're trying to look for.
I
And
like
here's
them. I want to
where
have lunch with
having,
them.
yeah, yeah,
Not a great
which
worker.
is great. They might make for a good friend, but not the best team member. So having predetermined criteria can help us here to make sure that we focus our evaluation on the things that matter instead of getting distracted by this
Mhm.
noise, because there's always going to be noise.
Yeah, always. Well, I can't recommend the book more. Make Work Fair, listeners. I look at my bookshelves and there's so many great DEI books over the years, but as we welcome in kind of this next evolution of books, I think really thinking about things from a fairness perspectives and this both and systems individual thinking is something I'm taking away from your work. So I'm very thankful that it's here, a guiding light for us, and
Thank you, Julie.
are, trying to make sense of all of this pushback and figuring out ways forward that works. And there is no shortage of data, tools, frameworks in the
Exactly.
book. So I really do appreciate that. And I appreciate the stories that show you how you can do it too. It's a rare find to find a book that can do the quant and the qual and
Oh,
really help people practically know what to do with this information. So thank you, Siri.
thank you, Julie. That's so kind of you. And thank you all for listening. It's been such a pleasure to join you for this conversation today.